In this video, we're going to talk about the interactions between different species within a community. We're going to look at the different types of relationships called symbiotic relationships that exist and what their possible effects might be, whether they're positive or negative or just neutral from one species to the next. Like the interactions between individuals within populations, in a community, different species competing with one another for limited resources can also obviously affect each other's survival. And finally, we want to look at how competing or maybe codependent species can have or force big selective pressures on each other as we look at how species interactions affect evolution. A community is actually just a group of populations. In a given area, it's all of the different types of species that live together, and especially all the interactions that we're going to look for. So with population studies, we looked at intra-specific interactions, or in other words, how the individuals within a species would interact. And in communities, we're going to take a look at how the interactions exist between individuals of different species. So something to keep in mind is with the growth rates that we studied with populations, those equations can be extended to include competition between two different species. When talking about community ecology, we need to talk about an organism's actual place in an ecosystem, and not just its physical habitat or physical address, but the organism's niche, its role, and how it actually fits into all of the relationships in a community. The reason is because its job or its role is going to include all of the resources that it needs to obtain, whereas another species might also be looking to share both that same habitat or that same job, those same resources. Here's just an example of a particular couple of species of mollusk, where in this example, the first species, it could and would inhabit a wider range of habitat as well as its niche if the second species was absent. But because they are both there, there's kind of a give and take, a trade-off, where each one has to make the most of its habitat and make the most of its niche. Because interspecific competition exists, or competition between two different species, there exists what's called a competitive exclusion. And that simply is that no two species can occupy the same niche at the same time. Why? Because of the available resources and the fact that those are limited. So when an organism consumes a resource, it's essentially gone. It's unavailable for individuals of even that same species or different species. So there's a negative hit or a negative interaction where two or more different species are going to attempt to use the same resource. So again, there has to be somewhat of a trade-off for that. And kind of a trade-off is what's called resource partitioning, or simply kind of dividing up the way that resources are going to be obtained. So it's different ways of using essentially the same resource. So we can reduce that, or in a community that can be reduced through microhabitats, where there's small specializations of obtaining and using that resource. So here's just an example in some specific types of a particular genus of lizards, where these seven different lizards are going to live in a close proximity, and they all happen to feed on the same insects or other small arthropods, whatever they may be in the jungle. However, competition for food is reduced because each of the lizards specializes or has a different perch or a slightly different habitat within that same area. And so if a difference in a resource use is large enough, then species can coexist. So all of this discussion about the interactions and how individual species are trying to carve out their niche and utilize their habitat and obtain the resources they need, we need to talk about interactions. And again, interspecific interactions is referring to the individuals competing with one another from a different species, as opposed to intraspecific, which refers to individuals within one species. So we don't really need to get too wrapped up in the prefix there, but you will come across it and you will see it. So these interspecific interactions are called symbiotic interactions. Symbiotic, where there's some sort of relationship. So we're going to just kind of discuss basically these 5 different types, and here you can review each of these types on this screen, but notice what is also in green is the positive or negative, or, for example, a neutral effect that one species has. So competition, because of competitive exclusion, remember that two different things cannot occupy the same niche at once. So there has to be limited resources in competition. That's really a negative for each when there's competition. Predation and parasitism, it's kind of the predator wins, the prey loses, or the parasite wins and obtains nutrients, or the host loses. So in parasitism, by the way, is typically the host isn't killed directly from the parasite, whereas obviously with predation, the prey is killed. Mutualistic relationships, or mutualism, both of the organisms and the species actually benefit. And in commensalism, which is a little less common, where it's pretty tough and it's actually arguable a lot whether or not one of the species is unaffected at all. Maybe a great example of that is a tree with a bird's nest in it. The tree is pretty much or completely unaffected by that, while obviously the bird gets a little home. So they win there. Or barnacles attached to the whale. Barnacles have a habitat carved out where they can utilize their niche, and the whale is unaffected. And then lastly, commensalism. It really isn't a big deal. I mean, I don't mean to oversimplify it, but commensalism is kind of rare. It's kind of like a bull in a china shop where one species is unaffected, but just by kind of being aloof to the environment around them causes damage. I mean, this could be cattle just walking across a pasture and just smushing various insects or uprooting grasses and plants, or another big mammal that just crushes out small animals just from walking. So that one isn't typically a huge effect in an ecosystem. So go ahead and pause the video here and just see if you can, without even having to identify any of the species, where maybe a couple of them might be familiar to you, like Nemo there, but maybe you see if you can talk about or identify why what you see in the picture would be considered a particular symbiotic relationship. So a number of these symbiotic relationships, but especially a predator-prey relationship, can be seen to actually drive change in populations, change over time. And predator and prey relationships really are kind of a focus because they really provide strong selective pressures on each other. Predators drive strong selective pressures on the prey populations to survive, and prey populations can select the best, basically, hunting or locating characteristics in predator species. In virtually any community within an ecosystem, you can point to species adaptations that aid in survival and fitness within that community. And specifically with anti-predator adaptations, to highlight a couple, ways or adaptations that help species hide from their predators, so avoid their detection, some sort of camouflage, or adaptations that warn predators, like stay away from me, this could be bad if you actually try to hunt me down. And then kind of fake out little jokes that are played on predators. There are a lot of different species that make some use of camouflage. And a lot of times maybe it's just kind of blending in with the surroundings, same sort of coloration that would fit in well. And some species take this to a whole new level of camouflage. Those species exhibit what's called cryptic coloration, which is really kind of cool. This is just kind of the tip of the iceberg with some pictures here. But some organisms have that exact color pattern that makes them virtually undetectable within an ecosystem. I think a pretty neat adaptation situation in ecology is called mimicry. And that's essentially where, through convergent evolution, either codependent species or perhaps predator-prey species have co-evolved in that one species kind of makes use of essentially the looks or maybe behaviors, but mostly looks of another organism or another species. And there's a number of different examples. The monarch and the viceroy are probably one of the most famous or notable, where the monarch can be actual poisonous to predators. The viceroy is edible, but a predator takes a look at it and basically stays away. Here with a coral snake, these two different types of snakes, one is poisonous and one is not, but predators are going to stay away from both of them because they essentially don't know which one. So there's different types of mimicry, and actually don't worry if you come across that. The lines between the types are blurred anyway, so we don't need to know the specific types of mimicry. So using aposematic species or coloration, different species tend to kind of resemble each other, but also some rather notable species just have this bright and very visible pattern or coloration, or maybe it's a call or behavior, but it basically just screams out, "Don't mess with me, bad things are going to happen." So you should really kind of pick up on the relationships here that are evolutionary in basis. Predator-prey relationships, parasite-host relationships, the relationships between flowers and pollinators, that these relationships really set up, again, selective pressures, where there is kind of an arms race, where one side, a predator may kind of, over time, get a leg up on its competition being the prey, whereas that's going to put a selective pressure on the prey species, and those individuals that are most fit are going to survive and then pass on those characteristics, whichever made them fit. So there's kind of a teeter-totter, kind of a balance, kind of a give and take, but or an arms race, but you should definitely kind of see how all of these interactions also have an evolutionary basis to them. So you should review the objectives of the video. Kind of three things. One, be able to describe interactions between species, those symbiotic relationships, and their effect, whether they be positive, negative, or neutral. Two, you should be able to describe how species can affect the growth rates of other species. So different species from different populations within a community, they compete for limited resources as well, which is obviously going to affect either one's survival. And then finally, describe how species can affect the fitness of one another. So competing or codependent species can really force big selective pressures on one another.